Sometimes love isn't enough. As an adoptive mom, people would often say this to me, as if to imply I couldn't love my son enough to change behaviors or heal his trauma, so I should probably just give up. At least that's how I took those four powerful words, which had buried themselves deeply in my mind, leading me to doubt my ability to parent my child. Sometimes love isn't enough. That is the truth. Oftentimes, you need love and powerful, personalized tools to raise a child who's experienced trauma and disrupted attachment, or a child who you're struggling to connect with. I am on a mission to help parents raising kids with a tricky past to show up with unconditional love and practical tools to lovingly manage even the most challenging of times. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Plus, if you like what you hear, I'd love for you to leave a review. Now let's get to the good stuff. Welcome back to the Sometimes Love Isn't Enough podcast, where in this podcast, we talk about how as parents, we love our kids. It's part of being a parent, I think. In most circumstances, that's how it goes. And I think as parents, society has conditioned us to think that if we just love our kids, everything will turn out all right. But when we're raising kids who we're struggling to connect with, and we'll be talking about that and kind of some reasons why that might be. The primary focus of this podcast is when our kids have come from a tricky past, when they've experienced trauma, they've had a disrupted placement or disrupted attachment. It's one of the many reasons where our kids can be really difficult to connect with. But I know in working with so many different families that there are all kinds of reasons why we might struggle to connect with our kids. And sometimes as parents, we don't actually know why. And that can be even harder on our heart when we can't figure out why. But for today's episode, I really want to talk about just what um, what led me to really shifting the way that I thought about my relationship with my son. So I've kind of mentioned this before, but in raising my daughter, my first child, it was so easy for me. I felt so confident, and it's not because she's a better person or she was easier or anything like that. For whatever reason, I found it easy to parent her, no matter what kind of challenges that we faced in, behaviors or advocating with or on her behalf with the school or whatever it might be. I found it easy. But with my son, I didn't. And as a mom, I found that so incredibly hard. I felt like such a failure. And in our home, I guess one thing that I want to make sure I say kind of early on in this podcast is that I respect my son so much and don't want this podcast to be about making him look like he's not a great person. I don't want this podcast to be talking about specific behaviors. I know sometimes when I've interviewed on other people's podcasts, I would say we dealt with a lot of challenging behaviors in our home. And sometimes interviewers will say, like, what exactly? Can you tell our listeners what those behaviors were? And my answer has always been, I'm sorry, but no. I'm not here to talk about my son's story in that way. I'm really here to talk to you as a parent about the experience of being a parent. Because, quite frankly, I'm not in my son's head. I don't know, and I probably will never know how he experienced being an adoptee. I hope that at some point he's able to share more about his experience and his feelings, but I don't expect that from him. And I really want this podcast to be about sharing the experience from an adoptive parent's perspective and then providing really practical tools to help you shift the way that you're thinking and feeling and showing up for your kiddos. Because if you're here hanging out with me, if you're here listening, then that tells me that you want things to change. You want better for your family. And so in this episode today, I really want to talk about what that catalyst to change was. What was it that really shifted things for me? Because going into parenting my son, making that decision to be a foster mom and then making the decision to adopt, I went into those decisions and that relationship with so much confidence. Of course, I didn't think that I knew everything. I'm not a fool, but I felt confident. I felt like I was very well prepared with what I could see from my current circumstances. And so as behaviors quickly became challenging in our home, um, as behaviors became challenging, as we had more outsiders kind of looking into our home, whether it be police or social workers or caseworkers or therapists or, every level of support, as we had more and more people involved in our family, sometimes in our home, I began to slowly over time break down. And I lost my confidence and I lost my ability to see myself as a good mom for my son, honestly. I mean, some of the words that I would say to myself were, I feel like I'm such an awful mom for him. I feel like I don't know how to connect. I feel like I don't I don't know what else to do to help our relationship. And it was hard. It's hard as a mom to feel like you don't know what else to do to repair your relationship. And I couldn't see my responsibility in our relationship. At the time, I really very much, and this was based on my own paradigms about life and how parenting should be, based on what I was hearing from the experts, based on what I was, reading in books and learning through all the trainings that I was going to, is that what I was hearing was that it is the trauma that our kids experience that makes it so hard for them to connect, makes it so hard for them to manage their own behaviors. So, the part that I didn't understand was that that was my son's experience, right? He had experienced a tricky past. But what I was frustrated with were my own thoughts and feelings. I didn't get that at the time. um, but I felt like my frustration was inevitable. I felt like if these things are happening in my home and I'm trying so hard, of course I feel frustrated. Of course I feel overwhelmed and resent and regret and all of the things. I couldn't see that there was another way to look at the situation. I um I I had a couple of other people in my life who were dealing with challenging behaviors in their home or even reflecting on the families that I served. At the time when things were the trickiest in my home, I was working in the autism field and had worked with hundreds of families at that point. And I always found it so fascinating how some parents could deal with such big challenges, or at least I perceived them as challenges in their home. And some parents didn't really skip a beat. Some parents loved their children unconditionally and were happy when their child made progress and had successes and were just loving them unconditionally when things were at a bit of a standstill or even when things got hard. And then other families that I would work with were easily overwhelmed by what seemed on the surface to be really easy things. And I always found that so fascinating. Why are some parents so well equipped to handle the challenges and some parents not so much? I would oftentimes share with families as a behavioral example how, in the checkout line at your favorite store, that, toddlers or young children quickly learn how to get the goods in the checkout line, right? If your kiddo is into snacks or candy, going through the checkout line can, for some parents, be really hard. And I would often explain to parents in helping them understand about giving attention to behaviors that if your child fusses because they want candy and you get them the candy, then chances are really good that the next time you go to the same store or any store really, chances are pretty good that your child is going to fuss to get the candy again because it worked for them, right? Um, and I would explain then, if you don't give in when they're fussing and then they start crying and you still don't give in, and then they start screaming and yelling and kicking and throwing things, and then you make the decision of, "You know what, we're just gonna get the candy just to get out of here." Well, chances are pretty good the next time you're at the store that your child might just jump right to what worked for them. They might just jump right to this kicking and screaming and yelling to get that candy if they really want it. And you know, I but some parents don't do that. Some parents don't ever give in, and I was that mom. I was the mom who the kids can act however they wanna however they wanna act, but if we made a plan that they weren't getting candy that day, well, they weren't getting candy that day, and that was easy for me, but I knew it wasn't easy for other parents. Then when it came to my son's behaviors over time, that kind of silly example of the candy got harder and harder and harder for me. And my feelings inside about our situation became heavier and more negative and much harder for me to handle. And so, what is it that changed in me? Because now, as I'm helping families, as I'm looking back on my experiences and really reflecting on them, something huge changed in me. Well, I had mentioned, I think in the intro episode that one of the big things that changed for me was hiring a coach. Um, I I didn't know. It sounds silly to say it out loud, although as you're listening to this, you might be in the same place that I was not very long ago, but I didn't know how much power I had over my own thoughts and feelings. And so, one thing that was so powerful and something that I share when I'm working with clients, it's actually one of their first homework things that I give to them because, well, it works so incredibly powerful for me. But I don't know if you've ever heard of Bob Proctor. He is a life coach, a mentor, and he was my coach's coach. And I have just learned so much from listening to his book, reading his articles. I've gone through his very powerful trainings. But the one thing that keeps resurfacing and something that I just keep going back to now, I mean, I've worked with a coach for a couple of years now, but I just keep going back to this is an article from Bob Proctor called Responsibility. It's just that simple, and it's a super short article. You can probably find it if you Google it. If you can't reach out to me, I'd love to share it with you. But in this article, Bob talks about our responsibility as humans, and that when I think, I guess before I jump into that, but I imagine that as you're listening to this, you're like, well, of course I take responsibility for my own actions. That's what we as good humans do, right? I know before I started working with a coach, when I was in the thick of it with my son at work, I felt like I was taking full responsibility for my actions. However, I often felt frustrated, overwhelmed, felt a victim in my own home. And so, in reading this article and really reflecting on what it means for me in my life, it was a bit of a slap in the face at first. So, be warned before you read it that sometimes it can be a kind of a hard pill to swallow to realize that when we're feeling frustrated and overwhelmed, it's because we're not taking full responsibility. And um, there's something that I have underlined in here. I've gone through this article so many times, and each time I write new notes, it has so many different colors on my printout. But I write new notes for myself, and a couple of things that I wrote. One is that I underlined when you take responsibility, blame is eliminated, and you're free to grow. Meaning, when I take full responsibility for how I was feeling in the moment when things were so hard in my home. When I take full responsibility for my thoughts and feelings, it becomes impossible to blame my son for what I was feeling. Because when I take full responsibility, I know that my frustration was a choice. I did not see it that way then, but the more that I learn about humans and the brain and how our mind works, the more that it becomes so apparent to me that when we as parents take full responsibility for what we are thinking and feeling, when we really learn the tools to do that, we stop blaming our kids. Because here's the secret. Your kids aren't putting that feeling of frustration in your head. Your kids aren't putting all of that anger into your head. Those feelings that you're feeling are a direct reflection of your thoughts about how things should be. And, since you can't change other people, blame is so inappropriate. We don't have control over our kids. We can't control their behaviors. The only thing that we can control is us, how we show up. And I know that that's not easy. I know it's not easy to hear, and it's really not easy to do. But when I look back over all the incidents in my home where my body was having a physiological response, my adrenaline was high anytime, and it increased over time, right? Like it wasn't like that when my son was 5 or 6. It started probably when he was about 7, when we had our first big incident. And um, each time that we had another incident, my body more quickly each time had this physiological response where my adrenaline was high and I felt like I was in safety mode, protective mode for my family, for myself, for my son, for my daughter. But I now know that when I was in that safety protective mode, it's because of the thoughts that were running through my head. And I didn't necessarily know that they were going through my head at the time, but oftentimes I would share them with others, right? As I would process through what had happened, I would, share with others about the thoughts that were running through my head. And oftentimes, when I look back now, oftentimes the thoughts that were running through my head were rehashing what had happened in the past, previous incidents, kind of a this happened again, here we go again type of thoughts. And my thoughts were about worrying for the future. I was creating thoughts about what might happen in the future. And in the future, I mean like 5 minutes from now, 2 hours from now, 10 years from now, but in the future. And what I know now is that as humans, we have the ability to work on shifting those thoughts to be much more focused on the present. And when we're focused on the present, our feelings and then our actions and the results with our kids change. When we have that power. And so as we kind of wrap up this episode, I do encourage you to reach out. I'd love to send you the responsibility article because it was a huge part of the catalyst to change for me and how I show up for myself how I show up for my son, how I show up for the people in my life that matter most to me, was me taking full responsibility for my thoughts and feelings. And it isn't easy. I still, years later, catch myself not taking responsibility. I still catch myself blaming circumstances, blaming the situation, blaming others for the way that I'm feeling. But nobody has that power over me. Nobody else gets to decide what I'm feeling. That's on me. That is my responsibility. And, you know, on the surface, it might feel like taking on full responsibility for yourself is a heavy weight to bear. But the truth is, when you take on full responsibility for yourself, you actually let go of so much that you're dragging around. Because when we're um, allowing other circumstances, other people's thoughts, other people's opinions to weigh down on us and dictate how we're thinking and feeling, that is a huge weight to bear. My goodness, before I started taking full responsibility, I was carrying around with me what what I thought other people might judge about how I was parenting my son, or whether or not I was following the rules of what I was supposed to be doing, or I was carrying around the weight of what I thought the future might be for him and for our family, and I was dragging along with me what I perceived from our past. I was dragging along so much weight. And once I started to shift my perspective about my personal responsibility, it feels so much lighter. It feels so much freer. And so I'd love to help you with that. So, yeah, send me a message. I would love to connect with you, share this article with you, and help you start shifting how you are perceiving your responsibility in your family. I hope that you found this episode so incredibly powerful. Thank you for joining us for Sometimes Love Isn't Enough. If you resonated with what you heard here, please subscribe to this podcast and give us a review. You can also follow us on all the socials. Check the show notes for all the details about how to start tackling behaviors and creating a powerful, loving relationship with your child, a child who needs your love the most. And if your gut's telling you that it's time for a change now, book a free consult. I'd love to help you love unconditionally and show you that you have that power within you.